Good afternoon and welcome to the fifth and final episode of Energy UK's Mission Possible podcast series. There you go. And this one we're going to focus on today is around closer UK and EU cooperation on energy and climate change. I'm joined by three fantastically experienced people to talk about this for the next hour or so. And also, if any questions you've got, please do put them in the Q&A and we'll answer those towards the end. So I'm joined by Adam, Sarah and Matt, and instead of trying to do a terrible introduction about what they do and who they are, I'm going to start with yourself, Adam, and go from there.
Yeah, of course. So, hey, very good afternoon, everyone. I'm Adam Berman. I'm Deputy Director at Energy UK. I run our strategic advocacy, and for the purposes of this conversation, I'll say I'm one of a dwindling number of Brits who worked in Brussels, and just leave it at that.
Oh, fantastic. Sarah.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Williams. I'm Head of Strategic Partnerships at Green Alliance, and that's an environmental think tank based in Westminster, and I cover Green Alliance's work with the environment sector and trade, and obviously importantly for today with the EU.
Fantastic. And finally, Matt.
Hi everyone, I'm Matt Hind. I'm Head of European Affairs for National Grid, and I'm Head of our Brussels office, so still out there at the moment. And I've been working on European stuff for a long time and was in a previous life the British energy negotiator to the EU before Brexit, and have been working through the process since then.
Oh, fantastic. Well, sounds like we've got the right people. And so if I could start with yourself, Adam. So obviously got a lot of connections with the EU and obviously had been part of the EU in the past. Just can you set the scene for us about the UK-EU relationship and why it's so important, what the past relationship has been, and where do you think it's going?
Yeah, sure. So I think when it comes to energy and climate, actually it's helpful to put Brexit and our post-Brexit relationship to one side, because I think there's perhaps not a high level of knowledge generally about the extent to which we are interconnected, and we are deeply interconnected. We're interconnected both in physical terms and also in terms of the kind of values and ambitions that we have in this space. So I think on the energy side, we tend to think of ourselves in the UK as a bit of an energy island. You know, we produce our own electricity from wind and nuclear, whatever, and it goes to our homes. We don't really think about how we are plugged into the continent or more broadly. And, you know, that's not really the case. There are pipes and wires that span the North Sea, Channel, Celtic Sea, and everything in between, having energy flow in both directions. Both the UK and Northern Europe rely on each other to a really significant extent in terms of energy. And that's, you know, that relationship goes both ways. So at the height of the energy crisis, when a huge amount of Russian gas was no longer flowing westward towards Europe, we actually acted essentially as a sea bridge, and we filled the gap. We provided about a quarter of the lost capacity of that Russian gas to Europe, managing to keep the lights on and managing to keep industrial facilities going at a really, really difficult time. And that was because we had, in this particular case, it was because we had a couple of liquid natural gas terminals in the UK where we could bring in gas from abroad and regasify it and send it through to the continent. On electricity as well, when essentially half the French nuclear fleet was out because of a kind of major outage due to a family of reactors. Who stepped in? The UK. And it was because of the UK, as well as other European counterparts, that we could keep the lights on in Paris and across France. And so, you know, this relationship goes both ways. And that's just the current energy relationship. That's just where we are at the moment. As we move toward net zero, it's going to change, and the energy system is going to really, really develop and just become fundamentally different. And maybe just to use a really, really crude example of that, let's take wind. Wind tends to go from west to east. That means that in Ireland you can wake up and the wind is flowing, and then it moves over to the west coast of the UK, then over to the east, then over to Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, onto Norway. What you ideally want is a system in which at any given point we in the UK can be benefiting from that low carbon, cheap energy, and vice versa, that it can be the same in European countries, and it provides an export opportunity for us in the UK. Now, some of that infrastructure exists, but nowhere near the amount that is required to reach net zero. You also look at things like clean energy islands. We're hopefully going to have this really, really deeply interconnected North Sea, where we have these islands for clean energy generation with these incredibly efficient multi-purpose interconnectors which send energy flowing really quickly from one side to the other. Now, that doesn't really exist for the most part yet, but it will do quite soon. So that's on the energy side, and just on the climate side quickly as well. It's quite a rare place where both sides fundamentally agree on what is needed. Both sides have a legally binding target. Both sides have really stringent intermediate targets as well for net zero. Call it different things. In Brussels, they call it climate neutrality. We call it net zero. Both sides have effectively the same policy regimes in place. And obviously that is an overhang of Brexit for the most part. And again, I think we don't talk about this enough, that actually, if both sides have the same ambition, both sides have the same mechanism, and both sides have the same legislation, that it's entirely in our best interest to see where we can cooperate to achieve net zero faster and at lower cost. And so that's more about the values, but even on the energy side, there are huge opportunities there through the transition, things like carbon capture and storage, or the trade of hydrogen. You know, we have about half of Europe's geological storage capacity for carbon capture and storage. There are lots of ways in which, not only today, but in the future, we are going to remain deeply interconnected. And I think when we talk about the current UK-EU relationship, sometimes Brexit comes first and foremost, but actually this existed far before Brexit. And frankly, far before even we were part of the European Union and far beyond. It is something that we just have to grapple with. And if both sides want to reach a status quo in which they have cheap, clean, homegrown energy, which we can ensure is sent in the right direction, so that we can have it when, you know, the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, then we will have to work together.
Oh, fantastic. No, really interesting introduction there. And actually, Matt, it'd be good to actually hear about your feelings and your experiences on the ground in Brussels as well. Do you know, current, present relationships, how are they, and how have you found your work at National Grid talking with the EU?
Sure. So, I mean, I think I'd agree with pretty much everything that Adam's just said in terms of that relationship. I mean, somebody said to me once, the fundamental thing about the energy transition is that it's very regional. So if you take out the LNG market and the global oil market, actually, who do we trade gas and electricity with? Our neighbours. Where's the opportunities? It's the North Sea. So you have to cooperate. And it's worth noting that within the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement that was signed in 2020, the most detailed chapter is the energy chapter. So even in that context of seeking quite a thin relationship, there was an awareness that we needed close cooperation on energy. And if I look at it from a business perspective, with my kind of counterparts across the EU, we're all facing the same issues. The amount of investment we need to bring into grids, the focus on grids now. So you've had an EU grid action plan that was put forwards last year. The Commission estimate you need about, I think, somewhere around 600 billion investment in European grids over the next 10 years. In the UK, National Grid is investing 30 billion over the next 5 years, and that's an enormous amount, of unprecedented amounts of money that will be excellent for economic growth. It will support up to 55,000 jobs in the UK. But all of the challenges that we're facing, planning, consenting, the supply chain, all of our partners share this as well. So I completely agree with Adam. This is a shared endeavour. I mean, what's changed? Well, obviously, we came out of the single market in 2020 and we came out of the internal energy market. And that has had some concrete impacts, one of which is that we're no longer in a efficient trading mechanism with the EU, so-called implicit trading, market coupling, which basically, without going into the technical details, is an algorithm-driven system that really allocates electricity as efficiently as possible across the continent. Right, okay. We're not in that anymore, and that has a cost. But also, we're just not in the room. So we're interconnected into the physically interconnected into the European system on electricity and gas. And actually, what happens in Europe still impacts on us, and it still impacts on how the interconnectors function. And looking forwards, as we try and exploit the targets are agreed cumulatively with the all of the North Sea countries are for 300 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050. Mm-hmm. As we build out that infrastructure, we will have to find a solution to cooperating on the regulation to ensure that we can trade efficiently, we can build cross-border infrastructure as efficiently as possible, we can ensure cost and benefits are shared between the countries. Right. So yeah, things have changed, but there is a real need for us to make sure that we can find solutions to all of these issues that have come up.
And actually, I think National Grid's also is the Great Grid Upgrade. I remember seeing a lot of articles and points on that. And as you're upgrading as well, you may have mentioned this in as well just now, but when you come across some really exciting things that happen on the grid, you know, some examples of less SF6 and real holistic improvements that you make to the grid upgrade. You still feel like you have those fora to go into European rooms and still say, this is what we've found upgrading our grids and this is what we can bring as a learning, and vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's going to be one of the challenges, actually, because we are outside of the room, so it's finding those fora. Thankfully enough, we've got very good contacts at industry level, so we've got excellent relations with all of our joint venture partners, so the TSOs around the North Sea. We have excellent relationships with people like Wind Europe, Eurelectric, the people who are out there in Brussels making the case for how we develop the system. I mean, the Great Grid upgrade's a really good example of this, because I think we're seeing this across the continent at the moment. We need to go out and explain to the general public why we're doing this, why it's so important to upgrade the grids. And I think actually the Great Grid upgrade is being looked at as quite an innovative way of doing that. But you see great examples in other countries as well. Take the Dutch, for example. The Dutch have taken a really interesting stance on procurement, signing off large-scale framework contracts for, TenneT, the Dutch TSO, did a framework contract for converter stations for 14 converter stations for 30 billion. Without the projects, but knowing that was the demand coming for the targets in the North Sea. So you've got to be quite innovative and flexible about how you do this investment. And this whole issue of anticipatory investment, where you don't necessarily know exactly what the projects are, but you know you've got to get the supply chain in the right place, and you've got to start building out as quickly as possible to actually meet our targets.
Sounds really interesting, yeah. And then obviously, when it comes to a new government as well, so Keir Starmer's, I think, was visiting Germany recently. As an open question to you all, in terms of, we obviously work in energy and I wouldn't say no at the back of our hand, but we do work in energy. Do you feel at the government level, at those very high levels of head of states meeting each other, energy is on the radar for them as well?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I could just come in there, because I think absolutely it is. And if you look at the various interventions that have taken place from the Prime Minister, from the Foreign Secretary, from other cabinet ministers, they've talked about the headline issues of security cooperation, migration, veterinary deals, but actually also they've talked about climate and energy security and energy cooperation. And I think there is widespread understanding that this is one of those areas that makes perfect sense for engagement and a really good, strong working relationship, because you can't really do it by yourself, particularly in the North Sea.
Right, okay. And Sarah mentioned as well about, before this, about engagement and bringing a lot of people together. Have you found methods and ways in which work, messages that do work at the government level about how to get sort of the grid infrastructure and upgrades and net zero on the table?
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly the new government's got a huge amount on its plate at the moment, but yeah, it's really focused on improving the UK-EU relationship as part, particularly of its growth mission, although obviously, as you say, it's really integral to lots of the other missions as well, not least on clean power. And so I think a lot of the sort of, they look in the market for like practical, pragmatic solutions to issues, and yeah, we can provide a lot of them, definitely.
Yeah, sounds good. And then I guess also, we do talk around it not being a Brexit issue, but actually, Matt, I'd be particularly interested, I guess, in your previous experience to hear kind of what that relationship looks like pre and post Brexit. Has that changed much, or is there changes to come because of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd go back to what we've said previously, which is it's probably good to move on from this all being a Brexit issue.
Yeah.
We are where we are in terms of being outside of the single market. I mean, I think the government's been very clear in terms of its position on that. I think the key thing about energy and climate is that, unlike a lot of other sectors, there is a very strong reason for the UK and the EU to cooperate for mutual benefit. And that is slightly different to other sectors. In fact, there's only one real precedent for where UK-EU cooperation has really moved beyond the boundaries of the TCA, and that was over rules of origin for electric vehicles. And there was an agreement fixed on that to avoid new tariffs at the end of last year. And that happened because UK and EU businesses both went into both the British government and to the European Commission and said, we need to fix this. And I think that's kind of where we are in energy. Now, I mean, in terms of your question around what's the difference, I mean, look, when we were in the EU, we were a leading voice on energy policy and climate policy. Interestingly enough, in climate policy, I think we are still, if you wanted one area where ever since Brexit, there hasn't been that kind of tailing off of the relationship, it's climate. There's been great cooperation at the COPs, for example. There's been great cooperation in terms of that international climate policy cooperation and diplomacy. When you get to the more technical side on energy, though, we're outside of the internal energy market, and that's just a legal and practical fact. So it's meant that the fora that we would have been in previously, like ENTSO-E, the European Network of Transmission System Operators, we don't have access to that. And that's problematic because actually what you see is all of the infrastructure planning that goes on across the EU, so the 10-year network development plan, the offshore network development plans, the UK doesn't really have a voice in that. And obviously on the UK side, we've got the new central planning systems being brought in by the NESO. The strategic energy plan and network development plans. And the question is, how do those link into the wider European planning systems? And we need to find a solution to that. We need to find a solution to cooperation in the North Sea, for example. So going back to your point, these are all kind of practical things that we need to fix. But in the context of that wider reset, I think it feels like this is an area where industry on both sides is in the right place. At a macro political level, there is a real awareness that energy and climate's an important area for us to work together on. So it's just how do we find those solutions now?
And I wonder whether it's worth saying that at that kind of higher political level, the signals all seem to be relatively positive. I mean, okay, fine, there's not technically a commission yet in Brussels, but there is almost a commission. And in the new commission's priorities, which have been published, a better relationship with the UK, including energy security, is in the written document. That's really good. On the UK side, they talk about a reset. There clearly are some challenging red lines that will have to be dealt with. But nonetheless, I think hopefully this can be widely seen as kind of turning the page on a really acrimonious few years of relationship that at times were just, really, really, really deeply kind of just unprofessional, really. And as a result, there's a lot of bruised egos on both sides and a lot of bruised officials on both sides, and I think that's entirely fair. They've had to deal with all the political shenanigans. And I think that is a bit of baggage going into the reset and going into what that relationship should look like. And particularly the fact that I think sometimes in London press we can kind of assume that we can just go to Brussels and you can just kind of have a new trade relationship and it will all be easy and hunky-dory. And I think inevitably after the last few years, particularly around the difficulties with Northern Ireland and the Windsor framework, etc., there is real nervousness about using that trading cooperation as the bedrock of any relationship, making sure that both sides abide by it to the letter, but then seeing where there are areas in which we can go further. And so, that is not going to be the land of milk and honey when it comes to the UK-EU relationship, but it does open up possibilities. Yeah.
I would just say, obviously that reset has already begun, but Labour have been very clear for quite a long time that they want to improve the relationship. Lots of articles in the FT about Rachel Reeve's desire for closer alignment in lots of different spaces, like chemicals. You had things set out in the Labour manifesto. Like you mentioned, the veterinary agreement, the new security agreement, that was all very clear. Yeah, they do still have red lines, not reopening membership of the single market, customs union, freedom of movement. But I think basically everything else is on the table, and particularly around realising the full potential of the trade and cooperation agreement, that Brexit trade deal. We haven't implemented it yet properly, particularly in the energy title, like electricity trading arrangements. We're just behind on that. So they've been quite clear about the desire to progress that. And we've had, as you say, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, and particularly Nick Thomas-Symonds, who's in charge of this work, leading on the work on EU for the government from within the Cabinet Office. So that's obviously a super important role. We've had calls with Ursula von der Leyen, they've gone to France and Germany, Brussels twice. I think Nick Thomas-Symonds was saying the other day. You had that important NATO summit where they spoke to people around the outside, but particularly you had the European Political Community Summit, which energy was mentioned on. So as you say, it's still such a long way to go, but just all of this mood music is incredibly welcome. And just being very clear about certain things, like Labour government is not going to upend the level playing field. We are going to respect international law. We're not going to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights. Just that basic level has been sort of re-emphasised, and we go from there basically.
Actually, really good to get your position on that as well, and your thoughts on that.
I think there's, you asked what the difference was, and so I used to work for the government in the Foreign Office. So one posting in Brussels as the negotiator, and prior to that I was the energy attaché in Baghdad. And post-Brexit, I have to confess that actually the situation was slightly more difficult in Brussels than Baghdad, which is gives you an indication of how relations kind of did suffer. But I mean, what you're just talking about in terms of that engagement with others, it's absolutely standard diplomacy, and it's rebuilding those bilateral links. It's really important doing it in capitals in Europe and building a dialogue and a great relationship with our key allies. But you've got to do it in the EU as well. Right. And there's no way really to improve the overall economic relationship that doesn't primarily go through Brussels and the Commission. So we've got to get that right. Going back to your point about rebuilding these relationships and getting over the last few years, that's essential as well, because there are some tricky issues here. And it's not just Brexit issues. I mean, we have to fix the trading relationship, because if we don't, this is going to be a problem for future investment. And going back to this target, 50 gigawatts in the UK, 300 gigawatts in the North Sea overall, we don't need grit in the system. We need to ensure that everything is as efficient as possible. Apart from anything else, for running complex offshore infrastructure like the new kind of generation of hybrid interconnectors, we have to have efficient trading. We have to be able to plan in a cooperative way. We have to be able to develop joint cost and benefit sharing mechanisms. But also issues like the carbon border adjustment mechanism, for example. Now, that's absolutely not a Brexit issue. That's just what happens when you're a third country next to the EU and you get hit by one of their climate policies. So, carbon border adjustment mechanism is the external border tariff around the EU. It will hit a bunch of sectors that are covered by the emissions trading system, including electricity. Right. And the problem is, it is both a non-tariff barrier in terms that you have paperwork and reporting and everything to put into it, but it's also a tariff barrier because you don't have a price convergence between the UK carbon price and the EU carbon price. And those kind of things stop investment if we don't fix them. And so we need to kind of that's another issue that we need to get fixed by linking the emissions trading systems.
Yeah, and Adam, you mentioned this in Mission Possible, the Energy UK's documentation around this, around CBAM, cross-border adjustment mechanism. Any further points from yourself and for Energy UK colleagues?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important one. I mean, I'll finish with a silly analogy with the entire relationship, because it feels like, yes, this early stage diplomacy, all the right signs are there. It's a more mature relationship, I think. It's getting to more serious conversations. But it feels like you're at a kind of teenager's party and both sides are at either side of the venue, of the dance floor. Eventually, one of them's going to have to come to the other side and say, I would like something. I would like a change in our relationship. And I think Brussels has made it fairly clear that for the most part, it's going to have to be the UK. Now, that can be born out of a better relationship, and that can be made easier. But if the UK wants to go further in its trading cooperation agreement, or even wants to implement things already within there where we haven't gone all the way, then it's going to have to make the first step. And I think that's, we're only 2 months into a new government, so I'm going to give them some leeway. But I think as we get to 6 months in, a year in, that is what I think industry will expect of new government. And one of the areas that I would be really surprised if a new government doesn't look very, very seriously at is this area of the carbon border adjustment. And, this is a real mess, and it's a mess where we have a very, very stringent timeline that underpins it, which is that come 1st of January 2026, British companies are going to have to pay in an extra tax, which they haven't previously paid for before. A whole set of heavy industries and electricity as well are going to have to pay in to European coffers for the right to do business and the right to trade into Europe. And when we already have exactly the same mechanism in the UK, we already have a carbon price in the UK, which is essentially what the carbon border adjustment mechanism is dealing with, it seemed mad that we would allow this de facto extra tax to exist on British trade. For the electricity sector, unfortunately, there's a double catastrophe within it, in that because of the way the CBAM is designed, we can go into the very boring details of how it's designed, but essentially it puts a carbon price, it puts a tax on the exports of clean energy from the UK. So that means you can have wind or solar or nuclear from the UK, and it will have to pay a carbon price on export to the EU, despite the fact that it's completely carbon free. Right. So that seems a baffling thing to do if both sides are heading towards net zero at lowest cost, and really efficient trade underpins that. The place also where the rubber really hits the road is Northern Ireland. And that's probably the single reason why I think there is no scenario in which the British government cannot look at this seriously, which is that at the moment in Northern Ireland, the kind of position of the European Commission is that the CBAM will apply to Northern Ireland because they don't want it to be used as essentially a backdoor into the single market. So you could imagine, for example, Chinese or Indian steel being dumped to Northern Ireland and being sent through to the Republic of Ireland and then into the single market without having paid this kind of duty that represents a charge on the embodied emissions. Whether that's realistic or not, that is the Commission's position, and I think it's very unlikely they're going to change it. The UK's position is no, the CBAM does not apply on Northern Ireland. Again, you can get back to why this all happened, but I think practically, I don't know any British government of any political stripes that is going to allow Northern Irish customers and Northern Irish businesses to have to pay higher prices with a lower selection of goods because we are kind of going ahead with divergence for the sake of divergence. And that's all it would be. When both sides are doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same time with policy mechanisms that aren't formally united but are effectively doing the same thing, it seems very strange to me that you would put such a kind of, an issue at the heart of the union.
Very interesting, yes.
I mean, and also to add, we've all around this table made the case, I'm sure, for ETS, emission trading scheme linkage, to be a priority given the CBAM, and there's a clear date, like having to start to pay the EU from the start of 2026. Like there's a really clear date on that one. But equally, if you're Treasury, you've been getting less carbon price receipts because of the price in the UK has dropped because it's a smaller market. It's less liquid. It's just So there's lots of different departments that I'm sure are very interested in this area, and it says it needs to be a top priority. And I mean, Nick Thomas-Symonds has mentioned it as a priority previously, but there's some quite useful headwinds all pointing in the right direction. But it's complicated, right? And we know the example of the Swiss linkage took 7 years, I think, in the end, but that was a bit of a different situation. The systems hadn't been copied over from each other, and there was some other politics involved. So
I think they had a referendum in the middle of
it. They did. over freedom of movement. So that did cause some issues. But so I mean, fingers crossed, it won't be as slow as that. But I mean, I'm not sure what people think, but it's a tight time frame to do anything.
It is. But having done quite a few European negotiations, I think, finger in the air, I think you could do it in 18 months to 2 years with right political will.
Brilliant. Oh, really? But I mean, there are some other dates as well, so that's a big one. But we've also got the 2026 sunset clause for the energy title. That's going to force some focus, and that's linked to fisheries really helpfully.
And the sunset clause is sorry?
Well, so basically, the energy title within the TCA that theoretically completely falls. End of June, July 2026. I can't remember which month it is.
It doesn't quite fall.
Okay, well it needs to be extended though, I guess, is the way I'd phrase it. And then you've also got that wider TCA review happening in 2026 as well. But I mean, lots of this stuff, particularly I'd say ETS linkage, can be done way before.
But I think this is such an interesting thing about the link to fisheries, right? Because there are certain things, when you're the British government and you're thinking, I want to reset the relationship with the EU, what's the kind of lower hanging fruit that I could maybe try and get some early stage agreements on, or at least negotiations on? You'd probably go for things that are already within the TCA, things like ETS linkage where there's already cooperation envisaged, you just haven't yet done it. And it's so interesting that on energy, the European Commission knows that the UK has asks on energy. And so they have linked it directly to one of the most political items of the TCA agenda, which is fisheries, where we are quite divergent in terms of what our demands are on both sides. And so it does make for what I imagine is going to be quite a challenging, even just a renegotiation of the status quo. And let's be honest, the status quo is not working at the moment.
Yeah. And that's the fundamental point here, right? As I said earlier, the TCA has a quite detailed chapter on energy, and that's great, but it's not working sufficiently that we can make the investments and keep the efficiency as high as possible for the functioning of the system and future investments. And I mean, the link to fisheries, as an ex-negotiator, I mean, it does worry me. And if I was to encourage both sides to do anything, I'd say find solutions on something we both know is essential as soon as possible. There is a milestone next year, which is the North Sea Summit, where there have been 2 of these previously, 2022 in Denmark, 2023 in Belgium. And the UK was invited in 2023, and we signed up to the Ostend Declaration, cumulative targets of 300 gigawatts by 2050, about 120 by 2030. That will happen again in Hamburg on the 2nd of June. That is an opportunity to push this agenda forwards as quickly as possible, because as industry, we need this to be fixed so we can go out and actually build the infrastructure that we know is necessary to both meet our emissions targets, but also to secure energy supplies for Northwestern Europe and for the UK.
Interesting, yeah. And sorry, if I could ask actually, is a negotiation, is there such thing as momentum? Do you really, focus on the low-hanging fruit first, just to agree almost on common ground, to then work up to maybe the more tricky or more complex agreements?
I think the phrase low-hanging fruit in the context of UK-EU negotiations is now slightly difficult.
Okay.
There are clearly things that are sensible and mutually beneficial, and an agri-food SPS deal is definitely one of them. Things that make the whole Irish sea border slightly easier are them. Energy and climate, I think if you could broadly include them in that because there is such a strong mutual benefit. And it's not just climate, it is energy security as well. And if you look what's happened to the system since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there has been a jump in the deployment of renewable power across Europe. Right. There's been a really big focus on the EU side, but also in the UK, on reducing the timescale for infrastructure deployment and permitting. And actually that's starting to pay off. The next big frontier on this is the North Sea. And if you look at kind of where we are at the moment, I think it's about 60 gigawatts, maybe less in the North Sea at the moment. Okay. It is less than that. But the intention for the 2030 targets is enormous. And we're seeing it with, AR6 yesterday. It's starting. Things on the European side are going in the same way. But there are headwinds on that, right? The increased costs, the increased interest rates over the last couple of years. So we need to make this as easy as possible. And when I talk to developers in Brussels, they say, we absolutely want to invest in the UK in cross-border projects, but we need to fix trading. We need to fix the CBAM. We need to fix planning cooperation. So there's real pressure, I think, from industry on this. What we need is policymakers to kind of pick up on that and really fix these problems as quickly as possible. Yeah,
and headwind, no pun intended as well, I'm sure. Yeah, sorry, Adam.
And maybe just quickly on the kind of negotiation itself, it feels like one of the prerequisites for doing it is that both sides are going to have to realise some of their opposition is a little bit silly at points. And so, to give you an example from both sides, let's start off with the UK side, and I'll break the cardinal rule where you don't say the thing that's already going on, which we all know, which is across a lot of issues, the UK is already copying the EU. They will not say so. You will not see that written down in a UK government consultation or a press statement, but senior officials will go to ministers and they will effectively say, it is not in your best interest to diverge radically. And so even though we're not formally joined across loads of policy areas, we just do the same thing. We call it a different thing. There's a Best of British badge on it. But I think sometimes when we're looking at negotiations where, for example, this dreaded phrase dynamic alignment comes up, where you're basically committing to essentially copy and work with the EU on regulations over the longer term, what we have to acknowledge is if you're already doing the same thing anyway, you're just not saying you're doing. But if you're already doing it, what on earth is the point in not dynamically aligning? So that's kind of the from the UK side. And on the EU side, equally we look at things like electricity trading arrangements where probably if we look back in hindsight, the Commission during the TCA negotiations agreed to a form of electricity trading that was really, really, really tough to make happen. And we have seen the Commission essentially just not be able to implement what they said they would implement through the TCA. Now, obviously there are faults on both sides. So, it's not that everything's Brussels' fault or everything's London's fault. But I do think that at the heart of this is going to be both sides coming together and acknowledging where because of the difficult politics of the last few years, they haven't been able to say, fine, this isn't working. Fine, in good faith, I'm going to come forward and say dynamic alignment would be really positive for a whole set of issues. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting there.
Okay.
And I mean, I think just on that point around trading, I mean, take the interconnector fleet, right? So there are now, we run 6 interconnectors with Europe, and there are another 2 with Ireland, and there's another
Just
one.
imagining Matt at like a console directing all 6.
Well, absolutely. And I know, but these have been enormously successful projects and enormously successful pieces of infrastructure and essential for the transition. I mean, I started working on energy, at least tangentially, back in 2007 when I was in the Cabinet Office coordinating European councils under the Tony Blair government. And the 2007 European Council signed off the 2020 targets in Europe. 20% GHG emissions reductions, 20% renewable energy, 20% energy efficiency. And even at that time, it was well understood, if you start putting variable generation renewables into the system, you have to have interconnection. It's what Adam was talking about earlier on, the efficient use of weather patterns and the efficient use of electrons. And if you look at the performance of the interconnector fleet, it's brilliant. It reduces costs, it increases security, and it's just fundamental to that. And as we move forwards, we're working on these hybrid infrastructure projects where you basically link offshore wind farms into 2 markets. That's a great way of making sure the infrastructure you're building is used as efficiently as possible to deliver that security and to reduce costs for consumers on both sides. We've got to fix trading for that to happen. And I mean, I agree with Adam. I mean, I think we've got, there needs to be a pragmatic discussion on this. And I think I'm very hopeful that will happen now. And you can tell in Brussels and in London, I think the atmospherics have changed. And that's exactly what we need.
And it's interesting, you mentioned around how, sort of, maybe not copying, but going, seeing across the channel and saying, that's a fantastic policy, I'm going to use that. I think flattery gets you quite far in terms of negotiations.
I mean, we probably wouldn't have put in place a carbon border adjustment mechanism if the EU wasn't doing it. And again, if you look at the Treasury consultation documents, there is barely a mention of the EU, but the EU is the first major jurisdiction. There's a sort of little carbon border adjustment mechanism in California, but basically the EU is the first major jurisdiction to put this in place. What does the UK do? After years of kind of saying, oh, well, maybe we will, maybe we won't, they come forward quite quickly and say, oh yeah, we're probably going to have to do this. And yes, it's going to be on a slightly different timeline to the EU, and yes, it's going to cover slightly different sectors and have a slightly different methodology, but fundamentally it's the same mechanism. I hope we can be at the point where UK officials can say to the EU, we use your design as the template. And that's because you spent a lot of time and effort on it and you engage with stakeholders and it's well informed. And hopefully we can just have a grown-up conversation in which you acknowledge the other's successes, of which there are many on the EU side and there are many on London's side. Just look at at the height of the energy crisis, there was lots of calls for reforming the energy market, both in London and in Brussels. What did Brussels do? They essentially nicked our last energy market reform, the one from about 10 years ago, the EMR. That's fine. I think that's a brilliant idea because it's quite a good set of reforms. But let's acknowledge that.
Yeah, I was just going to say about the crisis. I mean, one thing to remember about the crisis is the market worked. That's the other thing, right? Cross-border interconnection, the internal energy market in Europe, and the interdependence with the UK, it all worked in 2022. From what you said around gas, but also, talking about the electricity interconnectors with France, historically they've run at 10% imports to the GB 90% imports to GB, 10% imports to France, and that reversed entirely in 22. So this all works, and it's the question is how do you deal with the new situation? I think the one thing I would say is that for this to be successful, I think from a UK perspective, we need to look at what is of the mutual interest. Because we're just saying this is good for the UK, it's not going to work. We've got to work with our partners, be it in the NGOs and the energy sector on the other side of the Channel and of the North Sea. If we do it that way, and not to forget Ireland as well. Ireland are an absolutely essential partner in this. I mean, if you look at put it like this, look at Ireland's renewable energy targets for 2040. I think they've got a 20 gigawatt target for 2040. I mean, given Ireland's peak demand at the moment is something like 6 gigawatts, I think, that's potentially an enormous amount of clean electricity that's going to be available for export. At the moment, they will have a 700 megawatt interconnector with France by 29.
Okay.
So you can just see from that there is going to be quite a lot of excess power that will have to come out into the European grid via GB. So fixing this stuff will help Ireland as well. And I think that's where we need to work with all of our partners and with the Commission to find the best outcomes for us as a region around the North Sea.
Oh, very interesting, yeah.
But I think you're exactly right to point to the broad swathe of support behind this policy area. I mean, environmental think tank working with lots of NGOs. We don't always agree with industry on things, but particularly around this area, particularly around things like ETS linkage, we've been absolutely aligned on this. And that's not the case in other things. We often have sort of fights with the chemicals industry still about alignment and standards, etc. But this has been this is a real clear area where you can line up a lot of different organisations on both the UK and EU side. We still work very closely with sort of our EU sister colleagues in Brussels, or sister organisations, I should say. On this, and we intend to keep doing that as well.
Okay, and then I think obviously if you've got any questions as well that if you're watching, please do send them in. I think we must have crystal balls because we've answered some of the questions, the early questions that have come in. I think it is. As we then, that's where we are at the moment. Looking forward, if you had hopes or if you were in the elevator with Ed Miliband, don't know why you would, but you would be there. What would you be saying to Ed Miliband about cooperation with the EU?
I mean, I think the simple thing for this government at the moment is if you want to achieve clean power by 2030, if you want to do that as fast as you can, and at lowest cost, that cooperation is what helps you get there. It's not going to get you 100% of the way there. You're going to have to build lots of things, right? You're going to have to build lots of wind turbines and lots of pylons and etc. But essentially, if you want to build on that success, and that from 2030 onwards, you want to have a huge export possibility, because frankly, it's not long until we're going to be a net exporter in terms of energy.
Right.
We have, just yesterday, as Matt said, I mean, we procured almost 10 gigawatts of clean energy, of renewables in the UK. We've sort of got used to that, but that's a staggering amount of energy. We're going to have lots of it for sale, and it would be strange if we didn't look at that as a strategic possibility for the future. So I think for me it is about how you meet the government's own objectives at lowest cost. And I think particularly when you're looking at a government that frankly, is looking at some really, really serious fiscal problems, anything that can provide them with a bit more money, and essentially the way this happens through the UK EU side is it stops divergences, and divergences in and of themselves, they can often look a bit insignificant. It's a couple of 100 million here, it's 300 or 400 million there. Eventually it all starts adding up to real money. And unfortunately the Treasury sees things in billions, not millions. And that's why often it's quite hard to add together all these small divergences. But at the end of the day, if we want consumers to have the lowest energy bills, then this is the way to ensure that we knock those divergences out. We knock those regulatory barriers out one by one, so that we can bring down the cost of delivering clean energy projects, and we can bring down the cost of energy for homes and businesses.
Sounds good. And Sarah, yourself, you may have, ear of Ed Miliband. What are you telling Ed?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd very much reinforce everything that Adam just said. I mean, I think actually there's an interesting point there about sort of the government's approach and openness to alignment and managing divergence. Like you said before, it has been sort of swept under the carpet. There is strong cases for alignment on so many different areas, like this one. We've got product standards, you've got other areas like deforestation, which we're seeing a divergence, which is problematic, and just a slightly more thoughtful approach from government. And as I said, being clear about what it intends to do, how it does that, would be really appreciated. Yeah.
Sounds fantastic. Can you tell that?
I mean, I think my two colleagues have said what the key things are. I mean, I think the main thing here is that net zero and building out the North Sea it's an enormous undertaking. And so we should make it as easy as possible for businesses to make those investments and to build the infrastructure we need. And post the withdrawal from the EU, there are a number of technical issues that could be solved to reduce trade barriers, to reduce non-tariff barriers, like trading, like the CBAM, like planning cooperation. So let's fix those, because then we can get on as the energy sector with actually delivering these targets. Because at the moment, the situation we've got with this divergence does make things more difficult and more complex, and that's not what we want in this scenario.
Right.
we also need to find the space for good dialogue with our European partners, and that's one thing we have lost. Somebody said to me once, one of the tragedies of Brexit was in terms of the relationship with our European partners, was the fact that we left the single market coincidentally at the same time as there was no travel between the UK and the EU. So all of those individual personal relationships, which are so important in international relations and international diplomacy, need to be rebuilt. So I mean, I think the other thing I'd say, I was in Norway last week with the energy minister, and I mean, she's already started, Kerry McCarthy, the engagement with our bilateral partners, and that engagement with bilateral partners is absolutely essential. We need to remind people, I think, in Europe that, you know, we're the Brits still, we're the same people they've worked with for decades. We've got the same objectives, the same targets, and we can help each other.
Yeah, sounds good.
I think that's such an important point. Actually, you mentioned COP earlier, didn't you? And being like the one area really where the EU and the UK continue to work together during this sort of like moment when we were in the deep freeze, and particularly around sort of COP26. And I think that is a really great example because that did provide a forum by which these people came together and still had to work together. And obviously COP still provides forum. We can coordinate on our new NDCs. We can work together on influencing third countries, etc. But there, yeah, where is that joint working on sort of like energy, climate, environmental leadership? Like, there'll be new commissioners in place by the end of the year. Those meetings need to happen, but we need some sort of new forum, like political forum, because the TCA doesn't really provide that. The TCA is a lot more technical. It's got tons of committees in. I sit on the civil society committee on the UK side. So don't get me wrong, I really respect all the TCA and its infrastructure, but there isn't really the partnership like council right at the top. But there's not much else that's like very like for the like top political people.
So I totally agree with that. And so I'm also a board member of the British Chamber of Commerce to the EU. And so looking at it from a slightly broader sectoral perspective, one of the things that we would really like to see is a UK-EU summit system where the PM sits down with the President of the Commission once a year with all of the other senior ministers and gives strategic direction. Because you're absolutely right, the TCA process it's very bureaucratic, it's very inflexible, where it has been so far. Now, maybe that can be fixed. But what we really need is something like the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, whereas there's that space for policy dialogue to actually understand where we can move forwards together. So, you know, an Energy Trade and Technology Council between the UK and the EU, something like that would be really useful.
Sounds good, fantastic. No, very good. Thank you all for those elevator pitches. I like them. First question I've got here is, what is a multi-purpose interconnector, and how is it different from the standard, not standard, but the interconnectors we have now? What makes them multi-purpose? So
at the moment what we have is point-to-point interconnectors. So basically it's a single cable. Longest one in the world is Viking Link between the UK and Denmark. Went live in December. I think it's 762 miles.
Wow.
Slightly longer than North Sea Link, which is 746. But they dock directly into the neighbouring market. So a multi-purpose interconnector or a hybrid interconnector is you run a interconnector line into an offshore wind farm, and then you run a line from country A, say the UK, and then you run a line into country B from that wind farm or a number of wind farms. And that enables you to have a piece of infrastructure that can operate as an interconnector when the wind's not blowing, but when the wind is blowing, it operates as a connection into the onshore grid.
Right, okay. Very cool.
And maybe the point it's worth making is that I think when probably normal people who live outside of the energy sector, when they think about how it all works, I think maybe the image lots of people have in their mind is of a slightly kind of 1980s electricity system operator sitting at a console saying, I have these, 15 major generation facilities across the country and I'm going to send power from this one now, I'm going to turn this one up and this one down. When you're moving to a system in which you have thousands of dispersed generation sites across the country, and then probably thousands more of homes and businesses that are able to variably use their electricity, turn it up or down based on availability, prices, etc. You can't have one person sitting down and dispatching all of that. It just doesn't work that way anymore. Right. You need really, really efficient systems. You just need a really efficient computer system. And at the moment, we don't have that. That's what, when we talked about the energy title and how it's not currently working, even just what's currently in place, that is what is at the heart of it. Yeah. It's these inefficient relationships.
I've spent 3 years talking about kind of post-Brexit algorithmic-driven trading, and believe me, my head hurts when I even think about it. But we've got to fix it.
Sounds good. Sounds very good. And actually, a very, very basic question. Actually, I just think we're talking about interconnectors. What is the funding structure for interconnectors? So obviously they're connecting two countries together. How do you get them off the projects off the ground? It may not be a question for yourself or National Grid Ventures, but yeah, is there cooperation there? Obviously, there's got to be between both countries that you're connecting.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, these are joint ventures between National Grid Ventures in our case and our joint venture partners in the DSOs. And on the UK side, you have a cap and floor regime, but I mean, broadly, money is made because it's an arbitration regime between. So you send effectively how an interconnector works is you send electricity from where it's abundant and cheap to where it's scarce and expensive.
Yeah.
And that's the market working, and the market works very well to the benefit of consumers.
Okay, fantastic.
I have a
Sarah.
quick question, if that's okay. Well, it's more just around, so I guess for you, having those direct connection between like your equivalents is very helpful, but otherwise is it really the North Seas Energy Corporation Forum that underpins this sort of work, or should it? And because I just appreciate that we have an MOU, the UK with NSEC now, but to me it's still really unclear about like what we can do there, whether we're allowed in certain meetings, like what like I don't know whether that's just me being a bit
pass,
yeah exactly.
So going back to my earlier point, that kind of when I was the negotiator in Brussels, the joy was that I was in every meeting with my opposite numbers twice a week, plus the ambassadors once a week, and I had access to every single document of relevance. And now none of that happens to UK representatives in the EU. So NSEC is incredibly important. I mean, ironically, it was set up by the UK, or it was the inspiration was the UK about 15 years ago, and there is an expert in the Department for Energy, a lady called Sue Harrison, who is like basically the eminence grise of UK European energy policy, who set it up. And she continues to try and kind of work effectively with it. It's not that easy because, as you say, the memorandum of understanding basically says the UK can only be in certain working groups. And one of the problems is the working groups that they're not nominally allowed in, the ones that look at future policy, which clearly makes no sense because the whole thing about the North Sea is the deployment and the development of future policy. So we need to fix that. And actually the MOU doesn't work in that sense. Now, it's really good that we're part of it, and that was a genuine progress post-Brexit. I mean, there are various forums that we're involved with our EU TSO counterparts. They all tend to be informal ones because there is this issue around the formal mechanisms, so NSOE. There is quite a lot of sensitivity to the UK actors being in those. And I think we need to get over that because if we can't work effectively together, and not just on projects and trading and stuff, but on planning, on regulatory development, it will make things all the more difficult. And you lose the expertise from the UK as well. I mean, with AR6, I think we're probably back to global leader on offshore wind. We've led on subsea interconnectors. These are useful skill sets to be part of that European North Sea conversation.
Actually, to follow on to that, another question someone has is around missions more broadly. So are there any opportunities for UK-EU, EU-UK cooperation with things like research and innovation? And are there any then tie-ins with this quest? Well, there will be, but what tie-ins are there in the quest to net zero?
Well, I mean, there's Horizon 2020. Which is the big European research and development framework. It's great that we're back in that. I think, if you were talking to somebody from the government on this, they'd say all businesses should look at how they plug into that because there's lots of money that needs to be, pulled into joint projects there.
Yeah.
To give you a specific example of what's relevant to the transition, there's something called the Interopera project, which is something that was set up prior to us going back into Horizon. That's basically universities, TSOs, developers across the North Sea working out what should be there for standardisation of high voltage direct current interconnectors. So that kind of thing is incredibly relevant to us, and we need to be part of those conversations.
I think for me, the one that always we seem like we're heading towards, but never quite comes up in political discussions, is cooperation around supply chain for clean energy infrastructure. And the result of the energy crisis was that a lot of the West, but particularly Europe and the EU and the UK turned around and kind of said, "Oh, I can really see that it's not just this kind of moral argument for dealing with climate change that means we have to do clean energy, but the best way of ensuring our energy security is by building clean energy infrastructure in the countries we're in. And that meant that the UK, which had had a bit of a head start on a lot of this infrastructure, was suddenly competing a lot more strongly for the supply chain. Because if the West turns around and says, I suddenly want more wind turbines, or I suddenly want more, high voltage cables, it is going to be tougher for us and it's going to be more expensive. Now, even on the EU level, there isn't loads that goes on in terms of supply chain cooperation, but there could be. And I think it is one of those areas where, because the UK is such a big player, particularly on things like renewables, but also all the transmission infrastructure, and increasingly it will be in things like hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, there are areas of possible collaboration there. I mean, you saw at the height of the energy crisis, things like the EU coming together saying, shall we all do a big joint purchase of gas, for example, of liquid natural gas from Qatar or the US or wherever. Now, that system wasn't particularly well designed, but it was
whip round.
it was very well intentioned. And that is the type of thing that you could do. I mean, it doesn't have to be everyone comes together to do joint purchasing, but from the perspective of a supply chain company, the thing that can best give you lower long-term prices for the developers that are building the big infrastructure is certainty. And having all of these countries come together, the UK and the EU, on the supply chain side, even just coming out with a plan for what they need, that doesn't exist at the moment. You look at Commission documents, there's just a big black space usually where the UK is, and they just don't talk about it. and that seems baffling when you're talking about the North Sea, where who is the Ostend Agreement, where you have huge ambitions for offshore wind. Who's got the most offshore wind at the moment, and who will have the most offshore wind in 2050? The UK. Now, of course, there's political baggage that underpins why that's the case. I'm not saying it's not necessarily warranted, but we need to reach a point in which the UK is somehow back there. And I think when we're talking about things like NSEC, to go back to that, which is, I think, a really important institution. I loved working in Brussels, but for me, Brussels is the heart of the bureaucratic fudge, right? That is what they do. They've got 27 disparate member states with very different cultures and identities and values. They bring them all together and they come up with something that works. That's remarkable in its own way. And when you're dealing with the trade relationship as well, I'm sure there are ways in which we can engage with NSEC, which stop short of the full membership, which the European Commission is not keen on, but still allow us more dialogue and to be in the room in a substantive way.
I mean, either way, we need to make sure that, was it June 2025, as in Keir Starmer's diary and Ed Miliband's diary,
Yes.
which is the North.
Because the last PM
North Sea
didn't turn up.
didn't turn up. No. So I think that's a minimum ask.
Okay, there you go. Put it in the calendars. Fantastic. Well, do you know what? We've got 2 minutes left. Were there any points that either anyone wanted to raise before we close? Any closing remarks from yourselves?
I mean, I think from my perspective, just to say, energy and climate is clearly an area where we should be able to cooperate with our closest neighbours. There are lots of things we can do in the context of where the government has set out its European policy. So not rejoining the single market or the customs union, but technical fixes on electricity trading, on emissions trading, on planning, on supply chain cooperation. And I completely agree with what Adam's just said on that. Let's move forwards on this. So we as the industry can actually start investing in the projects that will deliver net zero and energy security.
Fantastic. And Sarah?
Yeah, just to really reinforce that, like the government have said they want to improve relationship, and actually energy, climate is just the obvious place to start. It's win-wins, like mutual interest, reducing costs, maximising opportunities in the transition to net zero. I mean, it's going to require some work, but it should be right at the forefront of their agenda.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and maybe just to lay down a challenge for this new government is, not just that it's a relatively straightforward area and should be done because of mutual benefit, but I mean, if you're looking to reset the UK-EU relationship and you don't manage to find areas of cooperation in this specific topic, you don't manage to find ways to pull each other closer on energy and climate, because you're not willing to make the compromises that does involve, and it does involve compromises on both sides. If you can't do that on energy climate, you're not going to do it on any other area, because if you can't do it on the area where you've got the same ambition, the same goals, the same policy mechanism, it's not doable for any other sector.
Yep.
Well, there you go. Gauntlet thrown. No, thank you so much for such an informative hour, and I hope you found it really informative too. This concludes the 5th and final Mission Possible podcast series. And so the last thing I'm going to tell you is thank you very much for joining. One of the next big events that Energy UK is holding is their annual conference on the 17th September at 1 Great George Street. And so you can find tickets for that at Energy UK's website. And so all there is to say is thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching as well, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.